Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of the Innate Wealth Pulse Check. Gentlemen, you both got a bit of a grin on your face because it's budget day, or budget, the day after the day that was. So lots to talk about today. But Luke, how are you today, mate?
I'm going wonderfully well, mate. How are you?
Well, you know, I'm a genuine nerd and I love budget night. So I thoroughly enjoyed every bit of last night. So I look forward to sharing some thoughts today.
I must admit, your darling shared a photo of you on Instagram sitting in, I think, your Ugg boots with a glass of wine watching the budget. And I'm just going, my God, you need...
Is that right? I haven't seen that. I need to talk to you about that because that's a bit cheeky. It was cheeky, mate. It was.
No, I'm good. I'm wondering how many people heard the line last night while you were sitting on the couch. I can't believe you're watching this crap. that was mentioned a couple of times at my joint.
Yes.
So we may be the other people out there watching.
That is true. That is true.
But lots to talk about
today. It was a big budget.
It was. Lots to talk about today, and it was a big budget. First thoughts, gents, what were your overarching thoughts to start off budget-wise?
Well, I think, look, from my perspective, I look at it and, it's very difficult to run a budget now and to make some bold calls when, in fact, the reality of the matter is that there's so many unknowns, so the assumptions that we've had to make to sort of, move on and sort of say, oh, we're going to deploy $98 billion into the economy, but we need a few things to go our way as well. And I think that we'll all concede that the reality is that we don't know if these things will go away. Will we have a vaccine next year, and so forth? So, well, unfortunately for us, will we even have our states and territories opened up? And what are the timelines around that? So, I think that the interesting part this time around is that a lot of the onus and responsibility has been put back on businesses, to sort of, put businesses in a position to say, we're going to try and give you incentives to go and employ, spend, invest, and hopefully get the economy up and going. I just hope that the consumer will have the confidence to actually deploy some of the capital as well.
Indeed. And how do you see it, Luke, at a summary level?
Mate, what I would say is welcome to what in essence was a Keynesian budget. Fiscal conservatism and all the things that we've talked about. We saw a spending drive that is unrivaled. And I think what was fascinating the most for me was sitting there and watch both sides of politics quiver. So, on the Labor side, this was the Labor budget. This was spend till the cows come home. So, from a Labor point of view, they might argue and say we didn't like where the direction of the money was going, but they can't dispute what the intent of the budget is. So, like I said, it was a Labor budget. From a Liberal side, you'll be sitting there going, oh my God, everything that we've been arguing about over the last 10 years in terms of fiscal conservatism, about getting the budget back to black and so on, that went out the window. So that was probably the most fascinating thing. I think the reality is this is a win for everybody that sits in the middle. And I don't call them the silent majority. I call them the normal people, not the left, not the right, but the people who sit smack bang in the middle. And the reality is the budget was what it was. It's a reflection of the times, a time of great uncertainty. And I think what the government have acknowledged is they don't know what's going to happen next. So what they've done is they've thrown a lot of juice into the mix and they're hoping like a Hail Mary that this all works out.
Indeed, mate. I think there's a lot to pick apart there. And hello, Luke. Welcome today, mate.
Hi, guys.
Guest panelists for today from a tax and accounting point of view. How are you there, mate?
Good.
I had a bit of trouble getting you into the panel there. Apologies about that.
All good. So my initial thoughts on the budget, obviously I'm looking at it from a tax focus. I tend to agree with Luke on that point in that they really did hit the middle. The increase of the 90% tax rate, increasing the threshold to 45,000, certainly is going to benefit a lot of households. One thing I think there was probably two parties that were hard done by in this budget, and one was small business. I think they had an opportunity to go a bit harder with small business. They certainly could have brought forward the corporate tax rate cut that's scheduled for next year to 25%. They could have brought that forward now, which I thought was a missed opportunity. And certainly if the over 35s, if you've been made redundant in a recent outbreak, it's certainly just going to be that little bit harder to enter the workforce where you're instantly $100 or $200 more expensive than someone else that's under 35 with that particular bit of legislation coming through. So I think there's certainly some wins out there. They did cover probably the majority of the population, but from my point, I think small business was hard done by, which was disappointing to see, especially how hard it's been for Victorian small businesses with stage 4 restrictions.
Indeed. Now, gents, lots to pick apart today. And before we do, a little bit of housekeeping. Of course, we are recording today's session and it is live on social media. And importantly, today is a general advice forum, which simply means that what we're talking about is general in nature and anything that's specific to your affairs, particularly given it's a budget and a lot of things are uniquely relevant to people in the audience. We'll pick that up with you offline, but of course it is general advice forum. But today, just for those who do dial in every week, we're going to run a bit of a different format today because there's a lot of information to get through. Unfortunately, the now famous statistical run from Mirko is put to the bench for today. Apologies, mate.
Buddy.
I still prepared my spreadsheet just for my own purpose, though, you know. That's okay.
I know you did,
you don't
mate.
want to hear about it. That's all good.
Indeed. But look, what we like to do today is
I'll listen later.
Well, we want to spend 10 or 15 minutes today just sort of trying to capture, I guess, those high-level things that came out of the budget. But what we do find in any budget, like most things, when you hear big numbers like $996 billion deficit, it is very hard to figure out what does it actually mean for each and every one of us. So what we do prefer to spend our time on today is really trying to dig into those assumptions that the government have actually laid out, because I think the magic actually happens in the assumptions, and it's one of the rare opportunities that we actually get a bit of an insight or look under the hood of how the government actually thinking about the pathway forward. So we'd like to spend the majority of time there. And of course, these sessions are always much, much better when we have a lot of interaction. And lately, we've had a lot of interaction in the chat room. So for those of you who are online today, that little chat function at the bottom there, please share us your thoughts and ideas and comments, and we will try our best to pick those up as we go. And importantly, no one can see them but us. But on that front, gents, I might just do a bit of a helicopter view of the key themes that came out of the budget, and please add in as we go. But from a personal household point of view, I mean, I think the big ticket item was tax cuts. They were brought forward, and effectively anyone who's earning about 120K or thereabouts is up for about $2,500 in tax cut each and every year going forward. So it's not an insignificant level of tax cut, and we're starting to see kind of that progressive tiering of taxes be simplified a little bit further. And I guess one of the other sort of interesting parts there was the expanding out of the 19% tax threshold to 45K, and that brings with it an increase in the low income tax offset to around $700. So I thought that was a pretty significant shift for those who've got a job, importantly, because obviously this budget, I feel, is all about jobs, and those tax cuts are great if you're working, but those who aren't have got different things there. On the downside of that, the job seeker payment from a household level was actually pared back a little bit from the end of December. The coronavirus supplement of $250 has been removed, which I don't know how you guys see it, but I certainly feel as though that may be a touch premature. But yeah, certainly it's going to roll back, which makes it hard for those who are unable to find employment by Christmas time. And given that we're in the middle of October, or start of October, it's probably going to be a challenge for a few in that regard. We also saw a little bit of a touch on granny flats, and it's a fairly specific area where capital gains tax is going to be exempt moving forward, and a bit of an insight what we might see in next year's budget around aged care. And I think here in Victoria, obviously, it's near and dear in our hearts that aged care has been probably one of those areas which has been an embarrassment really for the country and terribly distressing for those families that are impacted by it. But the government have actually allocated a little bit of money, $1.6 billion for some extra funding for people to stay with in-home care. And to put some context around that, today, if any of you had any experience with trying to have in-home care put into your house or into a loved one's house, it's almost impossible to get any support. So that's a big number, but I think it's certainly an awful long way shy of what's needed for genuine reform in that space. So perhaps it's just the tip of the iceberg for what we might see after the Royal Commission to Aged Care comes out in February next year. Gents, any quick comments on the overarching theme for households there?
I think the other one there, Shane, which I think is really important, was the mental health initiative. So the increasing of the number of sessions from 10 through to 20. From what we're understanding is those 10 are being exhausted very quickly. So pushing that out to 20 is a good thing. The only dilemma that we have at the moment, it's a bit like aged care. There are only so many psychologists running around. So they can't produce psychologists overnight, which means that you might have all these benefits, but people can't actually utilise them, which is a concern. And look, that's something probably we need to explore with the budget itself. A lot of these initiatives are predicated on this and this and this occurring. But if this and this and this don't occur, well, a lot of these initiatives are just initiatives. They won't be used. That's the issue. So that's probably one thing to the government's credit. They've recognised that there's a problem and they've tried to do something with it. But I'm not sure throwing money at it is the only way to fix it.
Indeed. And I think the other one there too, Luke, about extending our households, there's a couple of questions come through already, which we will pick up further. It certainly feels though at a household level, the big loser in the budget last night was in fact self-funded retirees. There was no allocation of anything for self-funded retirees last night, which was interesting, I thought, given...
Yeah. Look, it's funny that, because we actually spoke about this morning. If you think about the base who voted for, who re-elected the Liberal government, it would have been the self-retiree base, in truth. And if you think about the debates last year that were held on franking credits and the like and so on, and in this budget they've been totally ignored. So, take out a $250 Christmas bonus and a $250 bonus in March, and that's assuming you hold a seniors healthcare card. But if you don't hold that, there is nothing in this for you other than for the adjustments in tax rates. But if you've structured your affairs correctly, you weren't paying tax anyway. So, yeah, look, they've copped it. Hasn't been good for self-funded retirees in truth, which is a surprise given I would have thought a big cohort of the self-funded retirees does vote Liberal.
Yeah, right. I agree, and I think we'll pick this apart further too, Mick. Sorry to your point there, is that we've also seen stimulus and interest rates, flagged or stimulus already hasn't really hit self-funded retirees. Interest rates were flagged yesterday, perhaps go down again. So it is an area that we need to pick apart, particularly about the way in which business recovers, because I think a genuine focus now is what equity market returns look and feel like moving forward, because that's kind of the other side of the coin, which we need to kind of explore today, I feel.
Yeah.
Sorry, Mirko, you're going to add?
Yeah, I desperately tried to look for something inside the budget there for the self-funded retiree, and really the only positive light I could see coming out of it was, for the first time in many years that I can remember in recent budgets, is there wasn't any tinkering with the self-managed super fund and the tax rates and the like that go internally, because that's usually some, they're mucking about with those sort of things. So there's been no changes effectively that we've seen from prior years, which has been a positive for the self-managed super fund trustee.
And
I think
normally,
sorry, Shane, I think one area that we've probably not looked at, which is worth exploring, is based on all these heroic assumptions in terms of the share market growing in value, unemployment returning to normal, our GDP being 4.25%, that would imply a share market that is going to rise in value. And if that's going to imply that a share market's going to rise in value, it requires self-funded retirees to actually take on more risk within their portfolios to achieve the outcomes that they want to achieve. Because the double whammy in all this is they get no government support and they actually get no fixed interest support. With fixed interest being so low at the moment, self-funded retirees are actually, it's a really, really tough spot to be at this moment in time. So look, like I said, I was staggered last night because that was one of the things that just stood out, and we kind of thought, wow, nothing at all.
I think to that point, if I can add on that, Luke, is that superannuation is normally one of those areas which is a bit low-hanging fruit for the government. They always seem to tinker and try and take away from it. So they did leave it alone. But they did actually touch on, the other end of the the working life cycle for younger Australians today to have their super fund follow them, which I thought was a really a good initiative, and as well as a bit of a league table which is trying to rank and pit superannuation funds on performance. And those things, we sort of sit back and think, how on earth are they going to be able to compare accurately from Fund A to Fund B? So I'd be very fascinated to see what the scenario looks like down the stream, because we've debated in the past about what's a risk asset, what's a safe asset, and the variances are so significant on a fund by fund basis that comparing will be very hard. But I'm pleased they put on the agenda to try and give Australians a bit more clarity about how they make choices with their money.
Yeah, and look, and credit to them for coming up with that policy. I guess the cynic in me turns around and says, well, you've screwed the young people to such an extent through the early access to superannuation, and if we look at housing affordability and all the like. So the young people, we sit there and we're very quick to say they're entitled, they don't do much and all that kind of stuff, but they've cut the raw end of the deal. So having a policy which actually works in their favour for once is credit to the government for recognising. And in fairness, the government has a lot of the budget last night focused on the under 35s. So there's a lot around the employment piece. There's a lot around those sort of areas. So the government has recognised that, hang on, these guys have copped the raw end of the deal. So we're going to support this crew, which, if you think about it logically, they don't vote Liberal normally. So that's an interesting way to bring out a budget, I would have thought.
I think, Luke, too, off the back of the younger people support, was an interesting one I thought came out about backing first homeowners with less than a 10% deposit. So they'll wipe LMI and allow someone to buy a house with a 5% deposit. There's two sides to that, I suppose. I look at it and go, well, it's good to give that generation a leg up to get into the housing market. But I look at it and go, is it irresponsible where you're allowing younger people to take on a mountain of debt in uncertain times, potentially artificially inflate housing prices, where they actually don't have the ability to save or the capacity to save and actually pay back that debt at a future point?
And welcome to Royal Commission Mark 2.
Well, there that you mentioned that, they've also just come out and said that they would loosen the regulations around the lending as well. So all of a sudden, the responsible lending practices that we've put in place. I mean, be careful what you wish for sometimes. If this is what caused the GFC last time around, irresponsible lending. So we need to find strike a balance between realistic affordability and sort of pie in the sky.
And if I read those numbers correctly too, the first homeowner building grant has moved out from 750 to 950. So capacity to lend has gone higher as well. So it's, there's a few risk factors that are certainly present in that. But, again, it's sort of one of those damned if you don't, right?
Yeah, and it also assumes they've got a job, yeah?
Exactly. Yeah. Which I think is a great segue into, I was going to say the big part of the, sorry, Luke, to cut you off there, mate, but the big part of the budget last night really centred around trying to create jobs, to your point exactly, is that, to me, that was the key theme that came out of it, was a real focus on trying to create activity and jobs. And we can pick apart that surely as to whether that will work or not. But the big one, and I must say the government's been very clever with their use of wording, job keeper, job seeker, and last night the introduction of job maker in terms of another leg of policy. So that's where, Luke, you were talking before about $200 per week if you're between 16 and 29, and $100 per week for an employee between 30 and 35, provided that job you've created is a new position in the business and the person you're giving the job to has been in receipt of job seeker. So I'm sure there'll be a lot of businesses who take that up, and it's obviously clearly designed at trying to get people off job seeker into some form of employment.
The other issue there too, Shane, is that they've created a bit of a gap as well. So especially for the trades, you've got the apprentice subsidy that'll fund 50% of apprentice wages up to, I think it's $21,000 a quarter. But an eligible apprentice has to have been employed before 1st of July. But then you've got part 2 of that, which effectively kicked off on the 5th of October. So you've now got a gap between the 1st of July and the 5th of October where businesses may have employed apprentices, and we've got clients in our client base that are in this exact scenario where they've employed apprentices, and now this apprentice falls into this no man's land where they don't actually get any government support in relation to that particular apprentice. And also now if they've come off JobKeeper, they're not eligible to get JobKeeper either if they haven't met the 30% decline for the September quarter. So there's a real gap there where they've missed the opportunity to help small business out again with retaining apprentices and employees.
Yeah, it's an imperfect science, I think. The other side of the coin there, I feel as though that could be a consequence of this is that people who are, older or approaching retirement who do like to transition out of their current roles into part-time work, whilst I have absolute kudos for the government for giving a focus for younger people, it does put older people at a disadvantage under this scenario, unfortunately, which will be, obviously something we can watch with interest in the weeks and months ahead. But the other thing, gents, for actual businesses, we saw a huge amount of focus on writing off assets. And maybe Luke, do you want to give us a bit of a Luke accent? That is, it's very confusing when there's two Lukes on the screen, I've got to tell you, gents. But if you give us a bit of rundown on those write-off initiatives that were introduced last night.
Yeah. So the reality is it wasn't a huge change to the current legislation with the write-off. The threshold is still $150,000 per asset. What they have done is increase the turnover to include more businesses. To be honest, a business that's doing more than $10 million a year turnover, in my books, I probably wouldn't define as a small business, but they have now. So for the 2020 financial year, we have this really bizarre year where the instant asset write-off itself, the legislation still remains at $1,000. However, they've got these temporary increases, which they've kept bringing in pretty much every budget since they first brought in the increase from $1,000 to $5,000. So during the 2020 year, we actually have three different thresholds depending on when you purchase the asset. We have a $20,000 threshold, a $25,000 threshold, a $30,000 threshold, and a $150,000 threshold. So tax time's going to be fun this year. And what they've done is they've looked to extend that out, which is awesome. Originally, that was due to expire at midnight on the 31st of December this year, and they've pushed that out to the following June, which is great. But one thing that we want to keep in mind there is that it's not, well, I suppose there's 2 points. Is one, you don't get the $150,000 back. So it's not an instant, you get the money back, you get a percentage of that as a deduction. So take a corporate entity, if you spend $100,000 on an asset, you're going to get a tax deduction for $100,000. The net cash result to you, it's worth about $26,000 in that financial year from a cash point of view. However, it is a timing adjustment. It's not a bonus deduction. It's just a timing deduction. So you would have normally got to claim that deduction over a number of years. You get to bring it forward. It just means you're not going to get it in the following year. So the government's not necessarily forfeiting the money. They're just bringing forward the deduction and delaying their tax revenue they're going to generate that from that asset. Now, if you buy an asset in 1 year and sell it claim the full deduction and sell it for half the price the next year, you're going to pay the tax on the amount you sell it for. So you're only getting the deduction for the difference. So it's a very good headline about what we're doing for small business, but keep in mind it is just a deferral and a timing difference. So, but certainly a good one, and hopefully it will. I know when they announced it post stage 3 lockdown in March, speaking to car dealers and guys that are dealing with bigger equipment, they were run off their feet trying to supply new equipment to businesses that were looking to take advantage of that before 30 June. So look, I think it had the bonus effect of stimulating the economy, which hopefully it still does, but I think it won't be probably as significant as what it was pre-June, because everyone was trying to get the deduction for the 2020 year, where profits were still quite strong for the majority of the year before the pandemic hit. Could be a bit of a different story based on what's happening in Victoria at the moment, whether or not 2021 financial year is going to be as strong as prior years.
And it's a big piece there, isn't it? Because it's the other side of the coin they're trying to stimulate at this point in time, and it's one of the big assumptions I think we need to pick apart is the other side of that aspect of selling more things will result in more employment trickling down into businesses. But whether that translates or not, I think that will be very interesting. Now, gents, in the interest of time, I was just going to spend 4 or 5 more minutes on the actual initiatives and then jump into the actual assumptions that were made. And for everyone out there, we will actually share a full detailed analysis of the budget in all the specific details post the session today. But there was an issue about more apprenticeships, and I haven't read the full detail on that just yet, but it has been announced that there's 100,000 new apprenticeships to come through, and I often find it interesting as to what industries they will be applicable to. We've got a question that's come through here in terms of which industries they will apply to, so we will certainly make sure we get across that detail as it etches out. But the other big part of the coin, gentlemen, was infrastructure. Infrastructure was a significant focus last night, and I'm just going to read these projects for us here in Victoria. We're seeing $320 million for a Shepparton rail line upgrade, $208 million for stage 2 of the Warrnambool rail line upgrade, $292 million for the Barwon Heads road upgrade, $85 million upgrade Hall Road in Cranbourne, work on stages 2 and 3 of South Geelong to Warren Ponds upgrade. So we're seeing some significant amount of cash going straight to infrastructure, which in itself will create a lot of economic activity and get people into jobs as well. So, I think that's a key theme of the government right now is to spend, and hope that brings with it a significant investment from businesses from an employee point of view.
1.1 billion.
Finally, the other part
Shane,
that I wanted
Shane, 1.1 billion for Victoria, 2.7 billion for New South Wales. Did we get rolled in the allocation here?
We're in Victoria.
Build the tunnel, mate.
And if I read them correctly last night, there was a bit of a initiative out there for catch up for grabs more infrastructure based on who puts up their hand to do it first. So you can see a little bit of the politics at play with our states, and of course, correct me if I'm wrong here, but New South Wales have got a Liberal state government, so maybe there's a little bit of a looking after your mates type situation going on.
I like the term shovel ready. They're ready to turn soil.
Exactly. Now, the other part too, there was a research package for universities. I mean, we talked about universities a lot last week in our discussion about China. It certainly feels as though this is a sector which is going to need some support and a significant shift. The government have window dressed it a little bit and put some money out there and thrown it out to see what actually transpires. But time will tell, I think. But the bigger part there was more about the assumption that from late 2021, we can still bring people back into the country to be educated here in Australia. So, you can certainly still see that we're exporting education services as far as the government's concerned in the short term. Now, the only other part that I wanted to raise, and if there's anything else from your end, gents, to put in here that I've skimmed over at a high level from some of the key themes that came out of the budget last night, was that we have talked a lot about what the future Australia looks like and innovation for our country. And there was quite a bit of money thrown out there last night, which is designed to try and create some new industry, bring manufacturing back to Australia. A very little bit about new energy technology, so 1.9 billion provision for that over the next 12 years. So it's not a lot on a year-by-year basis. So the conversation has been started, but not nearly enough, I don't think, for that sort of renewable space. But we have seen a little bit of rhetoric around that from last night's budget, and I guess if in the fullness of time, we might see a bit more come through in the budget next year in May, given it's only 6 or 7 months away. But I know that's a very quick, high-level overview of the federal budget at a headline level. We could probably spend hours talking about this topic specifically, but I know it's a bit scary. But I think, gents, obviously, always the interesting stuff comes out of the assumptions. What were your initial view on the assumptions? The vaccine obviously is the big one that they had an assumption around. How do you see that, and are we kidding ourselves in terms of some of these assumptions that have been rolled out?
Well, the vaccine's probably the biggest assumption to think that we will actually have a vaccine come the second half of next year, that we'll be able to deploy it, that it will be taken up in large numbers. I think that's a huge assumption that's been made.
I think the other huge assumption is that we're one country. You just need to watch and pay attention to what's happening here in Australia. Is we don't have a coordinated response. We've got governments and states dictating to the rest of the country what they're going to do. So the notion of managing or administering for the national interest has gone out the window. Like if you look at something like the McGowan government in WA, I think one of the assumptions was that WA is not going to reopen until April next year. Now, no offence, they're doing okay at the moment, but for the last 5 or 6 years when they're in recession and they needed every dollar from the eastern side, I'm really struggling to understand what gives them the right to do that. It makes no sense to me. And I look at somebody like Palaszczuk in Queensland, and I just don't understand what gives her the right to do what she's doing. Now, funnily enough, they have an election, and the day after, the border's open. I hope Queensland does what they need to do because she is not good for the country. But that to me is a massive assumption that they've made. And until we start managing for the national interests, I worry a lot about that.
Just
to
the
me,
language,
the biggest.
I was just going to say, just the language that's being used, it's like open out there to say, oh yeah, we realise that on a state by state basis, we really have these, dual economies and dual sets of things going on. And yeah, WA, we're sort of hoping you'll be open by April next year, and Victoria, with a bit of luck, you'll be up and going by Christmas. And you sit back and go, I'm listening to a federal budget here, yet I'm having to hear all of the different idiosyncrasies that we have on a state by state basis. Incredible. Yet you're trying to plan for the country's future.
Mate, the thing that was really funny is on Saturday, and I haven't been watching the politics of Daniel Andrews or his regular updates, but on Saturday I just happened to be walking past the TV, and a line that caught me by surprise was Daniel Andrews staring straight down the screen, going, Victorians will not be lectured to by the federal government or Josh Frydenberg. Not bad for a bloke who's been lecturing for the last 3 months. And this is the point. You just kind of sit here and go, the sheer stupidity of what we're dealing with. So I think the federal government, the concern with the budget, Shane, if there is one, the rose-coloured glasses on the assumptions are rose-coloured. And if they yield the result, fantastic. But my God, there's a Hail Mary pass here in terms of what they're hoping.
For me, the biggest assumption was the line in there that said, and that's assuming there's not another outbreak or another wave.
Just the small detail.
Yeah, and I just look at it and go, how quickly what happened in Victoria escalated, and we're assuming that doesn't happen anywhere else in the country before they can come up with a vaccine. And to Mirko's point, the more people I speak to, there seems to be a real 50-50 on whether or not, if there was a vaccine produced, whether or not people would adopt it and take it based on how quickly or how rapidly it's had to be developed and brought to market compared to other vaccines that are 10 years, 12 years in the making.
I think if I can add some point there as well, one of the things that I found interesting last night is that the government use the kind of the best case and worst case type scenarios in some of their assumptions and kind of padded out the worst case scenarios. And it sort of strikes a little bit of the conversations that we regularly have about those scenarios or base case, worst case, different, situations. And the scenario of the vaccine with their best case is start administering by 1st of July 2021 and roll it out progressively for those who need it first and push it out thereafter, which is the first time we've seen some more detail about how that might look. Then the worst case scenario was, another 12 months on top of that, which sort of struck at the kind of the potential for rolling lockdowns. But the key wording that they continued to use in there was that social distancing, and I'm just reading it from quote, social distancing to stay until the end of 2021. And whilst it sounds like social distancing is a 1.5 metre keep apart from each other, those words are significant insofar as distribution centres have less production capability because they've got to socially distance. Offices like ours have to socially distance. So, there's things like that may have implications for many businesses that roll through next year as well, which I thought was an interesting kind of overview from the government.
That instantly flows onto, that's a clear line in the sand to say pubs can't return to full capacity, restaurants can't return to full capacity, sporting events can't return to full capacity. So to your point, it's a huge impact on the economy if we've still got to still have to have social distance in place by law through 2021.
I think the other assumption too, this is all predicated on the basis that businesses have got enough in reserve and can still survive. You know, and that's, you know, we're not, people haven't been shut down for a week. People haven't been shut down for a month. People have been shut down for, I think now in Victoria, where, you know, I was talking to my youngest child who's 14. You know, I think she's been home now for 192 days, I believe, in terms of what's gone on this year so far. If you look at the businesses that have been closed since then, you know, reserves are being used. People have gone into their lines of credit. I don't see how, you know, tomorrow, even if Daniel Andrews grows a brain cell and says, okay, let's reopen the economy in some way or form, and we do, I don't see how a lot of these businesses turn on the light, because I think the damage has been inflicted and caused. So, and that's the bit where you sit back and like, I think one of the assumptions that was used, a 4.25% growth rate. I hope that they're right. I've been doing this long enough to know that budget forecasts are never right, and they're never close, and they're always on the downside. So, yeah, you wonder about it.
No, and those figures are now starting to come through by some of the senior economists from some of the big banks, and sort of going, oh, geez, you know, we think that's a little bit overcooked, that rebound. And when you look at the unemployment, pretty brave person to think that unemployment will be back at sort of 6.5% in 21-22, when we actually don't know what the outcomes of, you know, the programs like JobKeeper and JobSeeker coming off, and those businesses you speak of, Luke, will those people actually have jobs to go to? You know, is that false economy now? And I actually think it is false economy in many instances. So yeah, so some of the assumptions that have been made around, you know, returning to, you know, the reduction of unemployment, the growth rebounds of GDP, and I think that, you know, they're questionable. And of course, you've got to draw a line in the sand somewhere when you make these assumptions. And but already the market is sort of picking up, and I'd like to think that, you know, some of the economists that we actually have out in the private sector have a very good handle on what's actually happening out there.
I think the other thing that we're also probably not really wanting to talk about, but the reality is we saw some pretty abhorrent behaviour over JobKeeper, where corporates, you know, for the want of a better word, rorted the system to achieve an outcome. You know, you don't have to be blind, Freddie, to realise what's going to happen here is if we can go and employ, you know, 5 20-year-olds, pay them, you know, just above the minimum wage, effectively from that point of view, we can essentially get free labour from that end. That's going to put a number of people who are currently probably in safe jobs probably out of jobs. You know, this is, you know, so I think the ability to rot and the ability to have fun with this, not necessarily for the common good, and I think one thing I do love about liberal philosophy is the blind faith it has in private enterprise. And it is blinded. And it always has had that faith. And, you know, it's something that we've grown up with and we embrace from that point of view. But the reality is, the more we've watched people's behaviour over the years, the less inclined you to say is, let's be blind by this. We've got to be vigilant. And I don't know if this policy is vigilant by any stretch of the imagination.
I think to that point, Luke, as well, is that, you know, thinking about businesses investing and employing, that to me last night, the loser felt a bit like Victoria was a loser in that whole process, because, you know, the unemployment numbers to peak at 8% on forecast for the country. But I'd love to see the breakdown of that in terms of what the skew is with Victoria versus the other states, because the JobKeeper stats show that about 60% of all JobKeeper recipients from now going forward are in Victoria. So our economy here locally is a fundamentally sicker place than the rest of the country because of the second wave of coronavirus. And that's certainly not politicking at all, but that's a reality of where we find ourselves. And you could see last night that there was no further initiatives for Victoria. And that's, I think, where you can see this kind of butting of heads taking place with Canberra and our state government.
Interestingly, they did allow the Victorian business grants that have been written over the last few months. They did come out and to state that they'll be tax exempt for businesses. However, they did turn around and put in the fine print that it's only the grant that was paid after the 13th of September, which pretty much you had to be in JobKeeper and you had to be one of the industries that weren't allowed to work with the COVID safe plan. So they were very careful about which grants they allow to be tax exempt for Victoria. And there'll be a very, very small amount of businesses that are, one, that were eligible for that second round of grant, and two, that will now no longer have to pay tax. So it's probably an insignificant handout for Victorian businesses.
I think one thing that the budget has really done here, from what I could see here, is it's not up to the federal government to save Victoria. Victoria needs to save itself, and Victoria needs to have an adult conversation with itself about when it's ready to open and so on. The reality is we're not opening because we can't contact trace. That's the reality of what's going on at the moment. And we have an incompetent public service and an incompetent government who can't manage that requirement. Because if they could, we'd be open. The reality is our averages are under 10. You only need to look around globally. Everyone around the world would be punching the air if they had their averages under 10, and yet we're not. So I think from that point of view, the frightening aspect about Victoria, Shane, following up on that point, is with each passing day, the gap between us and the rest of the country is getting wider. And the economic devastation and damage. And don't get me wrong, Victoria will recover. And the reason it will recover is it's the best state in the country, without question. And it's the most dynamic cities in terms of Melbourne and so on. So I don't have an issue with that. But the devastation that it's causing is going to set us back for years as a result.
We've had a few comments come through the chat here about tourism, and there wasn't too much on the table last night from a tourism point of view at all, or even encouraging us to travel locally, because we can't get our state borders open, so it probably makes it hard to forecast too far. But one thing I did pick up in the assumptions there on the tourism piece was that there was some wording to suggest that international borders to start opening late 2021. So it was kind of an interesting insight as to when we might see the possibility of international travel returning for us here in Australia, and of course it goes hand in hand with the vaccine globally, I dare say. But would we expect to see anything in the coming months, or do you think this is a state-based issue to try and provide initiatives at a state level to encourage people to come to their states and promote tourism at an isolated state level?
My view on that is that the government's, I think they've looked at it from a lens and gone, we've given people in the tourism industry, there's been a few grants that have been handed out from a state level initiative, and we've got a lot of those people who are eligible and on JobKeeper currently. And I look at them and I'm looking at going, well, is it going to take care of itself in the fact that once borders do open up for the states to be able to travel freely, everyone's going to be itching to get out and can't go overseas. Their assumption is that people will travel interstate and go on holidays and stimulate the local domestic tourism industry that way, as opposed to trying to push money back into it actively.
Yeah. Oh, I noticed South Australia started a clever advertising campaign here in Victoria, where they've got an ad running at the moment, which shows all the great things. And I saw it the first time the other day, and I thought, are they having a go at us? Because they're showing all the great things of South Australia. And I thought, well, that's nice to see because we can't go there. But then they finished off and said, when you're open, we're ready. And I thought it was a very clever campaign for South Australia. So perhaps, as I said, raising the point, because there's been quite a few comments about tourism, and a comment about cruise liners pushing out their, this is from the chat room, sorry, Jen, pushing out to April 2021 as a recommencement. So you can see private enterprise, to our sort of theme here, private enterprise is also making their own decisions about what they think's realistic as compared to what our government is sort of saying this is what's going to happen.
And it might not be the case. Sorry, Luke. Yeah.
I think the thing that really worries me about all this sort of stuff is that we seem to be looking for this vaccine and this hope and a prayer. And I think the reality is we should be dealing with it differently, in the sense of saying, well, how do we coexist with this thing? And I think one can't help but feel that the last 5, 6, 7 months has been, back in March, back in April, when we didn't know. But we're very or we've got a far greater idea as to what it looks like today. So I think what governments and businesses, and this is where the opportunity has been missed, is to sit back and go, well, okay, how do we coexist? Is it just the fact that we wear masks? Will that be sufficient? Is it the fact that we socially isolate or socially distance from one another to a metre, for example? But if we're wearing masks, we don't need to do that. What are the things that we need to do so we can get back to leading the life that we want to lead and start to travel and start to do things? Because this notion about borders being shut down, international travel being shut down till the end of 21, this is crazy stuff. And this is not good for anybody, let alone good for us from that point of view. So I'm stunned that as a society, we haven't wanted to have that discussion more so. Rather, we've been looking at our leaders who, look, at the end of the day, our leaders who are trying in difficult circumstances to do a good job, but ultimately they don't know what they're doing either. So it staggers me that we're not actually being a bit more forceful and demanding in terms of what we want.
And maybe that's the problem. Maybe the problem is we don't start with the assumption of that this thing's here to stay, and there's no there won't. Let's say there's no vaccine. So how do we deal with it? How do we innovate? You know, do businesses have half their staff rostered on one week, the other? You know, do we socially distance? Do we, implement different measures? And rather than having that discussion, we're sort of pinning our hopes and assumptions that there'll be some sort of magical solution that comes in the form of an injection or a pill or so. It doesn't happen that way, And
I think in that regard, is it not so? So I think the federal government have been pretty forceful about their view on living with the virus, and the discussion last night was exactly that the assumption, and Luke, you made the comment earlier about the virus is here to stay, and we're going to have outbreaks which are contained. So the federal government are very much in their assumptions, assuming that the virus stays, but it highlights the issue with our states, and the states can't even agree on whether it's Wednesday or Thursday. But the federal government, I feel, have actually to be commended in terms of trying to live with the virus, because of the way that they've been very forceful about that, I think, in all things since COVID started.
To me, Luke, your points, for me personally, your points exactly that is living with it is the hope of returning to some type of normality. And for example, I read an article the other day, there's a group working on being able to do a COVID test and have a result back within 15 minutes. So I look at that and go, well, is that the option to open up interstate travel then? You get to the border, you get tested, you wait 15 minutes. If you're positive, turn around and go home, you're in quarantine. If you're not, come on through, you're in the border. Same at the airport. You turn up, get tested, wait for your flight. If you're positive, home. If you're not positive, on the plane and off you go. So I think that gives you some normality to be able to travel interstate a bit more freely and help contain that situation of someone coming into a particular area, going to the pub and then having an outbreak in a new town or a new suburb or new state. I think that's reality.
You can take it a step further, Luke. Why don't you just wake up in the morning and do the test at home? So do the test at home, turn around and go, yep, I'm clear today. I can go to work. I can go about doing my normal things. And if everyone does that, then we're all clear and we're all interacting with one another and everything's okay. I think that the point that I'm trying to make here is hope is not a strategy. And unfortunately, the strategy that we're working to at the moment is based upon hope. And that to me doesn't make sense because hope is not the way you should go out and build a plan. Like we would never turn to our clients and say, we're going to build a financial strategy for you based on hope. We'd be laughed at in the industry. You wouldn't do it. So I think from that point of view, I think what we've got to do is we've got to start taking control of this sort of thing. And I'm not suggesting that we go down the Trumperian route of being a denialist and being stupid. So I'm not suggesting that at all. But I think we've got to start changing the mechanics of this conversation. Because my fear is we could be sitting here in 12 months' time talking about the same stuff again and saying, why did this budget not fail? Why the budget failed? Because it was built on hope is probably the point.
Well, thinking about the broader number, $996 billion is our forecast debt level in 2024but
let's just call it a trillion, yeah? Let's just round it off, right?
But I think, we've talked about this a lot, and the question that I've been asked a lot of times is, how are we going to pay for this debt? And, you'd think about it, the immediate thought in a household level is that we instantly go back and we start to save and start to pay it off. What we saw last night was the complete opposite of that. It's actually stimulating as much as physically possible. But I thought the interesting part in there is that the forecast in terms of serviceability of that debt is to maintain at a reasonably sustainable level at an expenditure level. So I feel as though that debt's a big number, but for us to kind of interpret that and understand it at a household level is that it may not be such a big deal having such a big number to get us through this issue, because serviceability is the key to our longevity as a country. Is there anything that we should share more broadly about that, Mirko, perhaps from your point of view in terms of the debt as it's forecast to peak?
Yeah, look, I think that the for us at the moment, the reality is rates are so low, and serviceability on any stretch becomes bearable, and the country sort of looks at that. My concern is that what if we do get a spike in inflation? What if we do get a raise in rates? And that can happen very quickly. People quickly forget where we were just entering into the GFC, when we had term deposit rates of 7 and 8%. And now we're talking about potentially going to zero. Come Melbourne Cup, when the Reserve Bank meets. So we need to be pretty cautious on that. I know there's been arguments about, will the government try and inflate their way out of debt and the like. I still think in Australia, when you look at our total debt to GDP, it's still at reasonable levels of under 50%, even though it is such a huge number. And I think that's very relevant, because there's not many countries that are actually under 100% of debt to GDP.
I think for mine, Shane, I think there's probably two parts to it. We've consigned future generations to a world of pain, and I think we've just signed up to the policy of we're going to have a lower standard of living moving forward. And what I mean by a lower standard of living is that those services that we hold near and dear, and the things that are important and things that matter. Obviously, when you're paying debt, you can't have those services. Okay, and if you think about the logics of it, the only way you can do that is by increasing taxation, which then has an impact on demand. So you wouldn't increase taxation, so they've gone and lowered taxation, and they're hoping like hell that we inflate our way out of this. And that's the point. So there's two parts to it. I think future generations, when I look at our kids, when I look at our kids' kids and their kids' kids, mind you, we'll probably be owned by China then anyway, so it doesn't really matter. But at that particular point, you sit there and you go, well, the reality is they're going to be, this debt's going to be there. It's not going to disappear. And I think the other issue that we've got here is that things like Medicare, things like aged care, and all these things we say must happen and so on, they're going to come under enormous pressure moving forward.
I think that's a valid point, Lukey, is the tax system. They've rolled out cuts to the majority of people this time around. But I think the card they're holding up their sleeve is eventually they're going to look at main residence exemption on CGT exemptions, because, and as much as it will suck, what it does is it's
technical.
It triggers a taxing point at an isolated event. So you're not taxing someone constantly at a higher rate. It's a one-off isolated event where they're taxing the person. And I think the other thing they'll at some stage probably review and look at is increasing GST to 15%. And it's a consumer pay tax.
I agree.
Well, I think, gents, in that space of last 4 or 5 minutes, question without notice, let's give it a bit of a rating, the budget, because, I guess the question that we've got to ponder here is we're going to have this debt that's there. The other side of the coin is what options do we have right now? And I think, if I was share my view, I think I'd give it a sort of 7, 8 out of 10, because I don't think the government had much option but to spend and throw the kitchen sink at our economy to try and to get our way out of this situation. And the consequence of that is unfortunately debt and implications that come downstream from that. But maybe, Mick, do you want to share us your rating? Then we'll go around the screen so I don't have to say Luke twice.
Yeah, I'm comfortable with giving it an 8 out of 10. I think that what we've seen has been a lot of monetary stimulus to date, and the fiscal stimulus is critical component of economic recovery for us. So I'm comfortable that we've done that. I'm actually quite pleased that we've had the confidence to sort of throw it back into the hands of business to try and drive this as well. And I just hope that with that comes some consumer confidence to actually be prepared to spend and deploy capital. And I just wanted to also make the one point, the one thing I am disappointed on, and Shane, you made the point that, you know, the federal government's been quite forceful in talking about, you know, containment and living with the virus and all that sort of stuff. That's no good to me unless they can be forceful with the country and with their own states. And at the moment, we're still at a federal level. You feel like we're being blackmailed by what's going on in different parts of the country. And until we resolve that, we're constantly going to be coming up against roadblocks and handbrakes, you know, all the way through.
Yeah, it's a hard one, isn't it? Because it shows, we've spoken about it a few times, it strikes at the heart of how fundamentally broken our states and federal system really is, and the lack of power the federal government have in these situations.
Yeah.
For mine, I'd give it a 5. I think it was a nothing budget in truth. All they did essentially was sign off on plans that they put forward 3 years ago and brought them forward. So, you know, the reality is, I don't think they had much choice, in fairness. So that's why I give it a 5. But, you know, because we don't know what we're dealing with, so bringing things forward makes sense. But if we think about the logics, we're dealing with a 1 in 100-year event. This required you to be bold. This required some innovation. This required you to think outside the square. And unfortunately, a bit like our current thinking in terms of we're hoping for a vaccine, I think this budget is hoping for a vaccine. And I think this budget needed to look beyond the vaccine. I think the Australian political system needs to look beyond the vaccine, in truth, but that's a separate issue. But yeah, so I'd give it a 5, just purely because that's half an hour of my life I'm not going to get back.
For me, I'd give it a 7. I think I tend to sit in your camp there, Shane, in that I'm glad they did throw some money at it and spend. But in saying that, I still do think they've missed some areas that they could have helped it. And look, maybe businesses are doing better, and I'm probably biased being in Victoria and seeing the impact that it has had on small business and businesses that, not necessarily businesses that set up and started 12 months ago, but businesses that have been around for 10, 15 years, 20 years, the impact that's had on them and households. So I would like to see some more money thrown their way. But again, I sort of think it's a bit of a nothing budget, in that in 7 months' time, we've got another budget, and there was a lot of assumptions in there around vaccine, not having another outbreak and those kind of things too. So it'll be interesting to see how we do actually track this budget, but I'm a bit of a skeptic on that front.
Yeah, look, I hope in that regard that we do see come next year, and it's a hope that we see the broader plan for the country, because, you know, last night was very much a Band-Aid in most of the issues were 2 or 3 years in totality, other than sort of tax reform at households. So it feels like a boost in the arm of the economy, but so with a bit of luck, we see some more planning.
Yeah, one thing I think is important to note too, credit is given to somebody like a Scott Morrison and Josh Frydenberg, because they have got people in their party, your Barnaby Joyces and those sort of guys who are completely nuts, who, you know, are arguing this conservatism route and so on. The fact that they've been able to bring the party back to the middle is a credit to both of them, and that takes enormous courage. So to their credit, they've set the baseline. Let's hope they can use the baseline now from which to build.
And I think there's a good comment in the chat room, which is as good as any to wrap up the session, I feel, and it says, I think you can only truly rate this budget in hindsight. And I think that's a very good point to make.
Bravo.
Time will tell, won't it? I mean, that's, you know, with the benefit of hindsight in a year's time, we might look back and think it was genius. We might look back and go, what a disaster. So we'll watch with interest. But thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I know we've been a bit of a whirlwind. It's been a fast-paced session, but there was a lot of information in the budget last night, and we will have a correspondence out today in the more detail, the nitty-gritty, for those who want to read in a bit more detail. So until we speak again, take care and keep safe. Bye for now.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks guys.
Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye-bye.